Alrighty, hello everyone, I'm Dr. Carlos Martinez, and today's presentation will be on responding to the Earth's cry, scientific and faith-based perspectives on the environmental crisis. Before I begin, I want to highlight this really beautiful image of our planet, our common home, as I like to describe, with its intricacies, the land, the ocean, the atmosphere, the clouds. This is the planet that we breathe in, the planet that we drink from, that we interact with, we play with, that we have fond memories with our loved ones, families, maybe our kids, coworkers. And so I place this image as a way for us to ground ourselves as we think about the intricacies and beauties of our planet and how we hear the cry of it as well, and what we can do both with the scientific analyses, but also our own values through our faith, through our backgrounds, our cultures, and a place that can bring real response to helping address our Earth's cry. So before we go into the impacts, we got to do a little bit about climate science. And so this is a 101 about it. So under a normal Earth, here we have our wonderful Earth, happy, joyous. The sun, with its solar energy, radiates photons or solar radiation onto the Earth, which keeps it warm. Without that, the Earth would be in complete ice age. There would be basically no life on Earth as we know today. What keeps that warmth in our planet is as that radiation comes to the Earth's surface, it then some of it gets rebounded back into space. But there is this natural blanket that keeps some of that heat trapped on our planet. And that is through, again, the natural configuration of our planet Earth. And so, what is happening? Well, because of what are known as greenhouse gases, or these heat trapping emissions like carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases, those gases keep the heat more effectively on our planet. So that heat cannot be released back into space. And so because of that, what we get is a thicker blanket. So imagine if you are sleeping, right? And you have your natural blanket, your comforter that you have. It's the summer, so maybe you don't really need a blanket, but you add 3 or 5 more blankets, you're going to start sweating. You're going to feel uncomfortable. And that is basically what's happening to our planet. Our planet is having a thicker blanket that is making it very uncomfortable. And we know why this is happening. Okay, so this is a graph that shows the Earth's temperature over time, the observed. And in this picture, we look at whether or not natural variability, so volcanic eruptions, the temperature of the sun, sometimes Earth can wobble over centuries. Can those factors explain the warming that we see? And what we see is how we do this is we simulate the Earth with those specific ingredients and see how the temperature would change if there is a volcanic eruption or changes to the temperature of the sun and Earth's wobbles. And if you see here, what we have is the natural factors combined do not match with the observed temperature. So this does not explain the rapid warming. If we look at greenhouse gases, which is the green line, plus the other human-made factors like land usage, so deforestation, for example, aerosols, Aerosols, human aerosols, can actually decrease the Earth's temperature. And then the ozone as well, ozone being emitted as well, the bad ozone. There's good ozone, which is in the stratosphere, that is natural, that keeps us from harmful ultraviolet or UV radiation. But this is the bad ozone that comes out of vehicles and emissions as well. What we know is that greenhouse gases is the culprit. The green line, as you saw earlier, closely matches with the observations. And that is why we get the warming of our planet. So what is happening then? How is this impacting our Earth? Well, let's think of it this way. Let's say you are cooking, right? And you have three main ingredients. You have water in your pot, you have a couple of ice cubes, and you have a potato. Not warming it up or anything, you just leave them all there. The ice cubes are probably still there for a little bit. Water's still just sitting there. The potato's there, probably a little moist, a little damp. But let's say you turn the knob, right, to about 300 degrees Fahrenheit in this instance. Well, what happens? Well, you start heating up that water, right? And what happens is the ice cubes start melting. What also happens is the steam, because the water is so warm, right? It's converting into water vapor, and so you get evaporation, and steam is coming out. And lastly, you get a hot potato. And this is what we're experiencing right now with our planet Earth. You know, the ice is melting. Not so much the ice that melts, where the ice is already over the ocean, will not increase the levels of seas, so sea level rise. It is the melting of ice that's on land that then is flowing into the oceans. That is where we find sea level rise. So this is especially potent in the Antarctic, which is a land-based ice sheet, and over the Arctic, like Greenland and other Arctic places as well. You get more water vapor, which I'll explain that in a minute. What does that do to our atmosphere? And then lastly, the hot potato. The land gets warmer and the oceans get warmer, and that has huge consequences on extreme weather events. And specifically, when I talk about water vapor, as the planet warms, the atmosphere becomes less dense. What does that mean? Well, the molecules in the atmosphere are moving around much more quickly. So there's more space to hold things. And so because there's more space to hold things, the atmosphere is able to hold more water. And so what happens with that? Well, think about it as buying a new sponge, a very new effective sponge. And we see here with the before and after of SpongeBob. The atmosphere, in essence, is becoming a more effective sponge because it is able to take more and more and more water, which then takes longer for it to precipitate. And this is why in many communities around the world, we are experiencing long-lasting droughts, like in the western part of the United States, followed by rapid, intense precipitation, like an effective sponge would, holding all that water, and then when you wring it out, all of that comes down all at once. And so now that we know what's happening, why it's happening, what is the cry? It's not great. We currently, the temperature, which we've been able to record, the change in temperature from pre-industry, so before the fossil fuel era, we're now have surpassed 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is not technically breaching the Paris Climate Agreement Accord that the United Nations gave, because it is a 10-year average at or above 1.5 degrees. We just reached the first year. So if we had 10 more years like this, then that would be breaching then that Paris Agreement that many communities, that the international community agreed to stop the increased limit of temperature for. And so what are the impacts with a 1.5 degree scenario that's averaged over 10 years? We will experience more heat waves. Exposure to heat is quite potent for many communities, especially communities that are sensitive. Air quality issues, for example, don't have air conditioning. Huge impacts to marine ecosystems, bleaching, for example, the coral reefs deteriorating and declines in many marine fisheries. Sea ice. We might experience ice-free summers in the Arctic, for example, one every 100 years under a 1.5 scenario, and the loss of numerous vertebrae. Um, a mass extinction event, unfortunately. Now, you might be thinking, well, what does it really matter? Each 0.1 degree centigrade? Well, does it matter when you are sick and have 100.0 Fahrenheit versus 101.1 or 100.0 versus 100.1? Those differences make a huge difference, each tenth of a degree. And you can see it here between just 0.5 degrees, how much worse the effects will be if we reach 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. And that is unfortunately where we're heading. Under the current pledges and actions by the international body, we're expected to range in this range here between 2 and 3.6 degrees Celsius, and we are averaging right around 1.3, 1.4 or so over the past 10 years. And so there's a lot of concerns. And the impacts that we are expected to find are only to continue to worsen, as they already have been already. Many communities across the United States and around the world are experiencing hot extremes, heavy precipitation, or a combination of the three, including droughts as well. And just briefly to summarize, in the United States, in the 1980s, on average, we only experienced $1 billion disaster once every 4 months. Now it is happening every 3 weeks on average. And we had 89 of those in a 4-year span from 2018 to 2022. And many of those extremes events were exacerbated by climate change. They either made them more intense or the ingredients made it more favorable for those extremes to become apparent. And we see this too with temperature extremes. The northern latitudes, their increase in heat is much larger than other communities, notably in the Arctic region, 4 times greater than places in the subtropics and tropics. Sea level rise is another big issue, like in the northeast coast. We're already seeing observed trends and increases in sea level rise. We see this too in the southeast region. This is a satellite imagery of Isle de Jean Charles in Louisiana, where we're seeing what is likely flooding. Flood risks increasing because of sea level rise. In the west, if you love snow, if you love skiing, this is showing the change in snowpack in the future. And what we see is, for example, in Colorado, they will get a fourth of what they used to get back in the late 90s by the end of this century. Sorry, a fourth less of what they would have. Wildfires is another big issue, especially in the West, also in Canada, that then brings impacts across the US with air quality alerts and smoke. And then just glaciers. We're already seeing it now with the retreating of glaciers across many portions of the Arctic and what are called glacial downbursts, which happened in many communities across Alaska, for example, in Juneau, where you get flash flooding associated with the rapid melting of glaciers. So what can we do, right? It's an important question. And, fortunately, faith-based communities and the weather, water, climate community have a lot of shared commonalities with one another. When we think about how faith communities process grief with eco-anxiety, climate grief, with how many communities are very tailored to environmental justice and the ecological responses to our planet. Faith communities have a very pronounced role in responding to the environmental crisis, especially because faith tenets on environmentalism are in many ways similar across many different faiths and spiritual belief systems. And this is also true for indigenous knowledges, which have very fundamental indigenous traditional ecological knowledges and understandings on sustainability and taking care of and living with the planet and the environment around them. So the first thing that I share with folks is to talk about it, but talking about it in a values-based way. You having been born on this planet, you do not need to have a PhD, a master's, a bachelor's or any type of degree to be an expert on this topic, because the values that you instill alone can drive change, can drive conversation and curiosity in understanding this planet. You and your voice and your story and your experience has much more value than any graph and chart that I can ever provide to a single person. So, think about, for example, like I shared earlier, if you love to ski, you love the ski slopes, and you're noticing less and less snow on the slopes. You're seeing that the resorts are the cabin resorts are putting man-made snow in that area. Let's say you love fishing, right? You love salmon. It's part of your own sustainable way of living. The ecosystem of your local community, either in the Great Lakes or in other freshwater or coastal communities. But you're noticing changes to the behaviors of the predominant marine species that are in your local neighborhoods. Let's say you love gardening, right? You have particular plants that you love to grow, or you have a vegetable or fruit garden, and you're noticing that those plants are not sustainable as they used to be. Or you're finding actually some plants are growing that you never thought would ever be sustainable in your local neighborhoods. Or you love hiking. You enjoy a particular trail, and you're noticing that the leaves are changing much earlier than they used to, or much later, because of changes to your local communities in response, or rather changes to the environment that you are currently at. More so, I feel like for many communities, changes much later. The fall is becoming much later, and the spring is becoming much earlier. So you're seeing the growth of leaves and blossoming earlier than they would be. All of those stories have connections with people's lives. And I think that's especially true with faith-based communities. And the ways and the practices that one may have towards environmental stewardship and the hobbies that you share can be a really practical way where you can bring the science. So science is not the premise, but rather the guide in the values discussion that you're bringing. And then finally, meeting people where they are. Some people may not have the understanding and knowledge of what's going on with our planet. Perhaps they don't see it through the graphs and charts, but they see it in the hobbies that I mentioned, for example. That type of ethos, that connectivity, can bring people into the conversation that perhaps you didn't think could. And again, trusting in the other person as a friend, as a colleague, can go a long way in that. And then, of course, with spiritual and faith-based communities, especially meditating about it, going to your roots spiritually, finding a guide on our beloved earth through one's meditation, prayer, other reflective practices can be a great guide in getting one's mindset on how then to talk about it with others. And then I feel like once you can talk about it, once you can meditate on it, I find acting on it is quite critical as well. And these are just some examples with organizations that I've been a part of, like with Interfaith Power and Light, where they developed this huge initiative to bring solar panels across multiple communities in the DC region to connect communities on, being environmentally green in their house of worship. You can also speak out to various local initiatives, policy initiatives, both federal, state, and local. This is an example with Green Faith, which I was a part of when I lived in Boulder, Colorado, where the county was deciding whether or not to accept an extension of a permit with this industry plant that was one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the county. And the efforts by Green Faith and other communities being advocates for the importance of our environment, of the local environment in the Boulder County region, resulted in the county commissioners to reject the mining application to go forward. And many other multi-faith communities are doing incredible works in this space. This includes, the importance of planting trees, which some communities have done, and there are many initiatives in that space. Subsistence living and sustainable agriculture, lowering the cost for farmers. Traditional organic practices can be valuable resources there. This is an example from Greenpeace MENA on their eco-financing. So how to be a good steward financially with renewable energy and other resources on sustainable energy. And then, repairing and collection and recycling, reusing, composting, those types of individual actions can go a long way that you can also do with your own communities out there. There are a myriad of environmental threats that could be existing in your own neighborhood, and there could be organizations out there that are doing works in that. So highly encourage folks to seek those opportunities, because it's always fun, in my opinion, when you get to do these efforts with others. It is a great way to bond, to grow with one another, and you don't feel alone, and you don't feel like your 10 fingers do little. Really, this type of community-led action can really drive change. And one other thing too, which encompasses all of this, is this last slide that I'll share, which is your story matters. When I think of the response from the international community, which I think of as a big gear, and then you have the US or an individual countries' contributions to responding to this, that's like the middle gear. The gear that I think makes the most impact is the small gear, which is the community level, which is you. That gear is churning a lot, and it can feel exhausting, it can feel draining, but that gear does help move the other two larger gears. Your voice, your stories, the actions that you are doing individually, and also with your communities, especially with faith-based communities, which I do believe can make a real change and effort in this space, can help respond with what the science is also indicating. But your own knowledge, your own place-based individual knowledge and understanding through your own values, complementing with science, can make real change in addressing the environmental crisis that we face today. So again, thank you so much. And yes, thank you.